ever almost had one of those, like near-death experiences?
Like swerving at the last second to avoid an accident. Makes you think about the what ifs, right? What if things had gone a little differently?
Right.
Today we're diving into something called quantum immortality,
Okay.
which basically says some versions of us might actually live through those what ifs in alternate realities.
It's interesting how we humans are always kind of obsessed with this idea of cheating death,
Yeah, totally.
even if it's just theoretical.
Exactly. Like in this article from the collector you sent me, they were talking about surviving death by jumping into a different timeline.
Yeah,
It sounds kind of like science fiction.
it does, right.
But to be fair, so does a lot of quantum mechanics when you really get into it.
It definitely stretches the limits of what we think we know. And it's important to remember that this whole quantum immortality thing, it's still very much a theory. It's not like a scientifically proven fact, at least not yet.
Okay, that's good to know because my brain is already starting to hurt a little bit thinking about all this.
Yeah, it gets pretty out there.
So the article mentioned that there are basically two main ways physicists interpret quantum mechanics. Can you give us like the layman's explanation of those?
Sure. So the first one, it's called the Copenhagen interpretation.
Okay.
And it basically says that the act of observing something at the quantum level forces it to choose one state or the other.
Okay.
Like imagine a coin spinning in the air until it lands. It's both heads and tails at the same time, right?
Right.
The quantum world is kind of like that. It's this big blurry mess of possibilities until we actually look at it, and then bam, it's like the universe is saying, okay, pick a lane, buddy.
Okay, so observation is the universe's way of saying make up your mind.
Exactly.
Gotcha. Okay, so then what's the other interpretation?
So the other one's called the many worlds interpretation.
Okay.
Sometimes it's called MWI for short.
Okay.
And it takes a completely different approach. It says that those possibilities don't just disappear when we observe something. It says they all actually happen, but each one creates a whole new separate universe.
Wow.
So picture this. Every time you make a decision, like this morning, did you have coffee or tea?
Oh my gosh, I see what you're saying.
In the many worlds view, there's another universe out there where you made the other choice.
So there's a universe where I'm sipping tea right now instead of talking about quantum immortality with you.
Exactly.
Wow. Okay. That's going to take a minute to process.
It's a lot to take in, right?
That's wild. So how does this then connect to like literally living forever?
Well, think about it. If every possible outcome of every decision exists in some universe,
Okay.
then there's a version of you out there that has lived through every single near miss, every close call, even potentially death itself.
Whoa.
Like
Yeah.
dying in one timeline might just be like changing channels to the you that survived in another universe.
So it's like we're dodging bullets across the multiverse constantly.
In a way, yeah. That's the basic idea behind quantum immortality.
That's both terrifying and kind of awesome at the same time.
It definitely makes you think. There was this physicist, Max Tegmark, who actually explored this idea.
Okay.
He used the example of someone who keeps getting in car crashes.
Okay.
Like in some timelines, they're fine, maybe a few bumps and bruises, no big deal. But in other timelines, it could be much worse, right?
Yeah. It's scary.
But according to quantum immortality, their consciousness would always continue on in one of those timelines where they survived the crash, no matter how bad it got.
So no matter how many accidents they get in, there's always going to be a version of them driving off into the sunset. That's intense.
That's the gist of it, yeah.
Wow. Okay. Speaking of intense, can we talk about that cat for a second?
You mean Schrodinger's cat?
Yeah, you know the one. I feel like everyone's heard of this, even if they don't really understand what it means.
Right, it's kind of a classic. But it's a really useful thought experiment to help wrap our heads around this idea of things existing in multiple states at the same time before we observe them. It's called superposition.
Okay, so walk me through it. Why a cat, though?
Why not a cat?
True. Everyone loves a good cat story.
Exactly. So imagine a cat in a box, right?
Really?
And inside the box is a device that has a 50-50 chance of releasing some deadly poison. We don't know if the poison has been released or not until we open the box.
Oh gosh, poor cat. I'm already stressed out for this hypothetical cat.
Don't worry, it's just a thought experiment,
Okay, good.
but it helps illustrate the point. According to quantum mechanics, until we open that box and see what's going on, the cat is both alive and dead at the same time.
Mind-blowing, but also, I kind of want to rescue that cat from its box right now.
Yeah, it's a weird one to think about, but it gets even weirder if we take this a step further with something called the quantum suicide thought experiment.
Okay, quantum suicide doesn't sound good. I'm a little scared to ask, but please tell me more.
So instead of a cat, this time imagine it's a person. And let's say this person keeps activating a machine.
Okay.
And this machine has, again, a 50-50 chance of being fatal.
Oh,
So
no.
every time they activate the machine,
Hmm.
they have an equal chance of surviving, or, well, not, but according to quantum immortality, their consciousness would only continue on in those timelines where the machine, didn't go off.
Okay, so they would only experience the timelines where they survived. That's intense. So you're saying there could be a version of me out there who's done some really crazy stuff, like skydiving with no parachute or something. But since I'm here talking to you right now, that means that version of me must have survived.
It's a wild thought, right? But it all hinges on the many worlds interpretation being the right way to think about quantum mechanics.
So it's not like physicists are all in agreement about this whole many worlds thing.
Exactly. It's still very much up for debate.
Okay, so even if there are infinite versions of us out there, there's still a chance it's all just, a bunch of theoretical what ifs.
Exactly. And even if the many worlds interpretation does turn out to be true, there are still a lot of assumptions built into this idea of quantum immortality that we need to unpack.
Okay, so what are some of the catches then? It can't all be multiversal joyrides, can it?
It would be nice, wouldn't it, to just sort of slip into another universe when things get rough?
Sign me up for that.
Haha, right. But unfortunately, there are a few catches.
Okay, so what are the catches?
Well, the first big one is that for quantum immortality to even be possible, the many worlds interpretation has to be right. And like we said, that's still a big if. It's not like physicists have completely thrown out other interpretations of quantum mechanics, right?
All right, there's still a lot of debate about which interpretation is the most accurate.
Exactly. And there are some pretty convincing arguments against the many worlds interpretation, too. So that's the first hurdle.
Okay, so even if we assume the many worlds interpretation is correct, what else do we need to consider?
Well, the second big assumption is that there must always be at least one timeline where you survive no matter what.
So even with infinite universes, there's no guarantee that every possible outcome includes me still being alive.
Right. I mean, the many worlds interpretation doesn't mean that literally anything goes. The laws of physics still apply. So while it's theoretically possible that there's a timeline where you survive a plane crash, there's probably also a timeline where you trip on a crack in the sidewalk and, well, that's it.
Okay, so even in the multiverse, sidewalks can still be hazardous to our health.
Got it.
Are there any other arguments against quantum immortality we should talk about?
Yeah, definitely. Some critics argue that even if we do jump timelines when we die, it wouldn't necessarily be the seamless transition we might imagine. Max Tegmark, the physicist who came up with that thought experiment about the car crashes, he actually believes that our consciousness fades out gradually before we die, regardless of what's going on in the quantum realm.
So you're saying that even if we did jump to a different timeline upon death, we might not even be aware of it?
That's the idea, yeah. It's like that age-old philosophical question, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound? If your consciousness fades out before you even experience the finality of death in this timeline, did you actually die in the way we typically think about it? It's a mind-bending concept, to be sure.
That is pretty wild when you really think about it. Okay, so we've talked about some pretty heavy stuff today. Near-death experiences, alternate realities, the possibility of a kind of quantum immortality. But, something that the article touched on really resonated with me. And that's this idea that even if quantum immortality is real, it doesn't mean that our lives in this reality have any less meaning or significance.
Absolutely. We can't let the possibility of infinite other selves living out infinite other possibilities diminish the choices we make and the actions we take in this life.
Exactly. I mean, yeah, it's a trip to think about all the what ifs and alternate versions of ourselves out there. But ultimately, the reality we experience is shaped by what we do right here, right now.
I couldn't agree more. And it's a bit of a paradox, isn't it? On the one hand, this idea of quantum immortality suggests that every possible version of ourselves exists somewhere, making different choices and experiencing different outcomes.
Right. So in a way, everything that could happen does happen, just maybe not in the timeline we experience directly.
Right, but here's the thing. Even if our actions are constantly being rewritten and replayed across an infinite number of universes, it doesn't negate the very real consequences of those actions in our own timeline, in our own version of reality. Our choices still have weight, they still have meaning, and they still ripple outward, affecting not just ourselves, but everyone and everything around us. And that's a powerful thing to remember, even in the face of something as mind-boggling as quantum immortality.
Totally. And that kind of leads us to another interesting question. If our actions are constantly being rewritten across the multiverse, Does that change anything about how we view our own sense of responsibility and accountability for the choices we make? Like if somewhere out there there's a version of me making all the right choices, does that somehow absolve me of the consequences of the not-so-great choices I make in this reality? It's almost like a get-out-of-jail-free card for bad behavior, isn't it?
That's a slippery slope to go down for sure, because it makes you wonder, right? Where do we draw the line? If everything is ultimately okay because somewhere in some other timeline it all worked out, does that change how we should act in this reality? It's a tough question without any easy answers.
It really is, and it makes you wonder if we could somehow peek into these other timelines and see the different versions of ourselves playing out. Would we even recognize them? Would we like what we saw? It's enough to make your head spin, right?
Absolutely. But even though we don't have concrete answers to these big existential questions, I think simply engaging with them, grappling with the possibilities, is what makes this whole exploration of quantum immortality so fascinating. It challenges us to think differently about life, death, and everything in between.
I totally agree. It's a mind-bending journey for sure. And speaking of mind-bending journeys, we like to end our deep dives with a little something to ponder, something to keep those brain gears turning long after the episode ends. So let's bring this back to our listeners. Imagine for a moment that you had the choice. You could continue on in this life with all its joys and sorrows, its triumphs and its heartbreaks, knowing that it will eventually come to an end. Or you could choose to step through a doorway into another timeline, another version of reality, where your consciousness continues on, but with no guarantee of what awaits you on the other side.
Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me more about this doorway to another timeline.
It'd be a leap of faith,
Right.
like hitting that continue button without knowing what's on the next page of the story.
Exactly. A journey into the unknown. And here's the question for you, dear listener.
Okay.
If you were given that choice to step through that doorway and continue on in another timeline, would you do it?
Would you leave everything you know behind and take that chance? Or would you hold on tight to this reality?
Knowing it's the only one you can truly be sure of. It's a question without a right or wrong answer.
But it's one worth thinking about.
Don't you think?
Definitely. It makes you look at things a little differently.
It does. And on that note,
I think we've probably given our listeners enough to ponder for one day.
probably stretch their brains to the limit.
Just a little. But hey, that's what we're here for, right?
Exactly. To explore the big questions, the mind-bending possibilities.
Even if they don't have easy answers.
And who knows, maybe someday we'll have more than just theories about quantum immortality.
Maybe someday we'll have some actual answers. But until then,
Keep asking those questions.
keep exploring.
And keep an open mind.
Because the universe is a strange and wonderful place. We'll catch you all next time on The Deep Dive.
See you later.